Section 19 of Wanderings in New South Wales, Batavia, Pedir Coast, Singapore and China, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Wanderings in New South Wales, Batavia, Pedir Coast, Singapore and China, Volume 1, by George Bennett. Chapter 19. At daylight on the 2nd of June I left Batavia for the Pedir coast, on the north-east part of the large island of Sumatra, and about noon, it being calm, anchored off Huon Island, in the Great Channel. This island is a mere reef, or sandbank, with trees of some elevation upon it, which impart a higher aspect to it than on landing it is in reality found to possess. The passage by the western coast of Sumatra was tedious, light and variable winds and calms being very often experienced, although we kept some hundred of miles from the coast. It was, therefore, not until the morning of the 28th of June that elevated land was seen, being the islands about the Bengal Passage, which we entered about 10:30 a.m., having on one side the lofty wooded island of Pulo Bras and Pulo Nancy, and opposite to them the elevated island rich in vegetation of Pulo Way. Pulo Rondo was also visible in the distance. Our progress through the passage was but slow, with a moderate south wind and a strong westerly current considerably impeded the vessel. On entering further in the passage, we became more under the influence of the high land, and the breeze diminished. The weather was showery and unsettled, and the ship anchored in the evening in Guinguion Roads, in 11 fathoms, about 5 or 6 miles distant from the wooded coast. The land had a lofty aspect, abounding in profuse vegetation, and was possessed of much romantic and picturesque beauty. Since we entered the passage and proceeded along the coast, the mountains rose in peaked and various fantastic groups, forming the back view of the landscape. The low land near the beach was covered with timber. Hills rose gradually one beyond another, terminated by lofty mountains, towering in the distance, the whole covered by a dense vegetation. At this time the view was occasionally impeded by fleecy clouds passing over, giving afterwards an increased animated appearance to the scene by the refreshing showers they produced. At some distance from the mainland, straggling rocks were sometimes seen, either rising solitary or in clusters from the ocean's depths, some covered with a scanty vegetation, whilst the bare summits and declivities of others had a volcanic character. Around their bases the breakers dashed furiously, and the white foam raged against those rugged sides, which had stood the violence of 1,000 tempests, serving as a place of refuge for boobies, tropic and other oceanic birds, which here congregate and rear their progeny free from molestation. The coast, as we proceeded, maintained its picturesque character, the high land being clothed with timber, and the low coast trending between the more elevated parts, of a somewhat similar character to some portions of the island of Java and other islands of the Indian archipelago, was profusely covered with vegetation. On Pulo Way several clear and apparently cultivated patches of land were visible, and smoke of fires, but no habitations could be perceived. Most of the island was a dense jungle, seeming only calculated as a refuge for wild animals in the midst of its wilderness of luxuriant vegetation. The coast of which we had anchored this evening was, for the most part, low, except the land being elevated as it rose from the Point Pedro, but it was not of such a verdant character as the mountainous coast we had previously passed during the day. The low land, however, abounded in trees, among which the cocoa-nut palm was both numerous and conspicuous. The following morning, at sunrise, the atmosphere was delightfully cool and refreshing, and the land breeze brought off with it a delicious fragrance. At daylight we weighed past Point Pedro, and then the vessel sailed at a distance only of 3 miles from the shore. in from 12 to 14 fathoms of water, which afforded an excellent view of the varying features of the Archinese coast as we proceeded. During the early part of the morning the towering peaked summit of the Golden Mountains was visible and perfectly clear, but as the day advanced it became capped with clouds. It was elevated far above the mountains in the vicinity, and seemed situated some distance inland. The west side of the mountain was clothed with wood to the summit, and exhibits nothing in its aspect from which the name of Golden could be supposed to be derived, but as the Malays term it the Gunung Mas, or Golden Mountain, it has probably obtained the appellation from them on account of gold having been found upon it, and the English name is merely a translation of the Malay. The eastern side of the mountain has a similar densely wooded appearance from the base to the summit, as just mentioned of the western. The morning was fine and clear, and as we sailed along the high picturesque coast of this portion, northeast, of the beautiful island of Sumatra, with light and variable winds from west-southwest to northwest, it was extremely agreeable, but at the same time often caused me to feel regret that I could not revel amidst the botanical and other natural productions the coast and adjacent hills seemed to produce in profusion. Besides the elevated Golden Mountain there were many of great height, some of a saddle form, and the crateric summits of others imparted additional importance to the beautiful romantic scenery around them. The hills became less wooded as we advanced to the eastward, and lost much of their tropical character. This peculiar feature of the country was, however, occasionally resumed. A sandy beach upon which large trees were scattered, with a few thatched habitations of the natives, peeping from the dense foliage of the trees which grew about, with the cocoa-nut palms waving their feathered branches above them. This again gave the tropical character to our view, but the receding hills terminating in mountainous country, now but thinly covered with vegetation, varied the landscape, and it possessed little to remind the stranger of intertropical scenery. It was soon after noonday when we passed the bluff point named in the charts the Lover's Leap, and the coast beyond maintained for some distance similar features to that we had passed, excepting some portions which had an increase of picturesque beauty. The receding hills were not so elevated. White cliffs, bare of shrubs or any kind of vegetation, rose almost perpendicularly from the beach about the Lover's Leap, but still further eastward the coast again abounded in trees. Hills rose above hills, having in part a cleared appearance, but in general vegetation was most abundant. Lofty mountains formed the distant prospect, above the whole of which the Golden Mountain reared its peaked summit, terminating the rich and varied landscape in an extremely beautiful manner. From the few houses and canoes seen about this part of the coast, there seems to be a paucity of inhabitants, and no cultivation of the land was visible. The natives, however, may live in the fertile valleys a short distance from the sea-coast, and concealed from our view. The wind and current being averse, it was impossible for the ship to make any progress, and we therefore anchored about 7 p.m. in 12 fathoms, a few miles to the eastward of the Lover's Leap. The next day we proceeded along the coast, the features of which were similar to that before described, but beyond Pedir Point the country assumed a more populous and cultivated appearance. Cocoa palms abounded on the beach, thatched houses of the natives were numerous, and canoes and larger boats were busily fishing. The whole aspect of the coast was animated and picturesque. From light winds and calms, and strong adverse currents, we were often obliged to anchor, and did not reach the anchorage of the village of Pedir until the afternoon of the subsequent day, the 1st of July. The situation of Pedir is an extensive, fertile flat, interspersed with low verdant hills, and the distance terminating in lofty mountains, covered most profusely with vegetation. The village of Pedir, from which some extent of coast to the eastward has been named by Europeans the Pedir coast, is situated a short distance up a small and narrow river. The residence of the Rajah and a portion of the village could be distinguished from the shipping in the roadstead. The plain through which the river flows, and upon the banks of which the village of Pedir is situated, is an extensive flat, or for the most part a series of marshes abounding in rice plantations, and extending to some distance inland, apparently terminated by a dense jungle and ranges of mountains towering one above the other. To the westward it becomes hilly, trending out towards Pedir Point, and to the eastward terminates in lofty mountains at some distance. This description is given from the appearance of the country as seen from the anchorage. The whole line of coast has a beautiful and luxuriant character, abounding in coconut, areca, and other palms, and beneath the trees the thatched roofs of native houses are occasionally seen. Some vessels belonging to the Rajah of Achin were at anchor off Pedir, and others, having English colours flying, off the villages further to the eastward. The ships belonging to the Achinese Rajah were designated men of war, but a grab among the number was the only one originally the property of His Highness, for it had just conquered the bark, at whose peak the Achinese colours waved, but which had been the property of the Rajah of Trumong, who resided on the west coast of Sumatra, and with whom the Achinese monarch was at war. The remaining one, under the Achinese flag, was an English brig of Penang, last from the Maldive Islands, with the cargo of dried fish. She was seized for trading in arms and ammunition with the Rajah on the coast, who was at the time hostile to the King of Achin. I shall have occasion to return to the latter affair in another part of this work. The vessels were rigged in the European style, appeared of English build, and carried guns like merchant ships. They hoisted a huge broad red pennant, and the Achinese ensign, the field of which was red, the central ornaments of a white colour. Soon after we anchored, an old Mormon came off the ship from the Rajah, and arrangements were made to accompany him on shore the next morning to pay our respects to His Highness. On the morning of the following day I accompanied Mr. Henry Fearon, the supercargo, and the commander on a visit to the shore to have an interview with the Rajah, one of his attendants having previously been on board, bearing a multitude of salams from His Highness, and intimating that he would be happy to receive the gentleman arrived in the ship. At the entrance of the river we crossed the bar, upon which a surf is continually breaking, more violently at low water, or when the sea breeze blows fresh, than at high water. At this time there was comparatively but little surf, so we passed without getting wet. We then entered the small winding river, which, although deep at some parts, suddenly shoaled at others, except the channel was kept, which usually had a sufficient draught of water for light boats. But an inexperienced person had better have a native to pilot him, which prevents the annoyance of continually getting the boat perched upon spits and sandbanks. The course of the river is very serpentine, and after entering it, the banks are covered with shrubs and plants, forming a dense vegetation among the Acanthus ilicifolia, covered by a profusion of cerulean blossoms, and other flowering shrubs were numerous, as also the acrosticum aureum and other ferns. Native houses appeared mingled with the graceful waving bamboo, cocoa palms, plantains, and other trees. After proceeding a short distance up the river we arrived at the small village of Pedir, which is a collection of thatched Malay habitations. Herds of buffalo were refreshing themselves in the stream, and had a strange appearance when seen with only the head above water. The natives informed us that alligators were numerous in the river. We did not observe any during the time we remained at Pedir, but from the buffaloes not being attacked, it is probable they are not numerous about the lower part of the river. After bathing, the buffaloes, not being troubled with many of the projections called hairs, had their hides covered with a thick coating of blue mud, which preserved them from the attacks of insects. Those on the banks, both old and young, stood with their ludicrous physiognomies staring at us as we passed them. A number of the small hump-backed Bengal breed of cattle were also observed feeding about the plain. On leaving the ship, arms had been placed in the boat as a precautionary measure on this coast, where the natives are reported to be oftentimes unable to distinguish between meum and tuum. But on landing they were left in the boat, and our Jacks, not having the fear of the natives, or of a reprimand from their commander, before their eyes, took a morning's walk about the village, leaving the boat, together with our weapons, under charge of a boy, which proved the precaution was needless, as the arms, reposing at the bottom of the boat, were in this instance equally as ineffective as if they had been in the hands of the men. After landing we were conducted through an extensive bazaar, planted with several shady trees, called ba, asan, by the natives, the closeness of their foliage and extending branches affording an agreeable shelter from the fervour of the sun's rays. The market seemed well supplied. We were conducted from this to the hall of reception for strangers, which was a small room elevated a short distance above the ground, opened on all sides, with an ornamental projecting roof. The ascent to it was by a rude bamboo ladder, like an approach to a hayloft, but as the Rajah ascended by the same staircase, of course we could not complain. On entering the room we found some chairs of European manufacture, standing on 4 legs, but most of them minus arms, backs, etc. In these we were requested to seat ourselves until the Rajah arrived. Some coarse mats were also laid upon the floor in the centre of the room, or perhaps cage would be a better nomenclature than room, for it was more like the latter than the former. We waited patiently the arrival of the Rajah for some time, surrounded and gazed at by several old, grave-looking, bearded Moormen, who remained silent, as their organs of mastication were almost incessantly engaged in chewing the betel, their teeth being blackened, and lips become of a brick-red colour, from the use of this masticatory. It is said that it is a good stomachic, causing the breath to be always sweet, and the assertion may be correct, for the breath of the natives, who are in the habit of chewing the aromatic compound, is agreeable, but the discoloration of the teeth and mouth, caused by its use, gives a disagreeable appearance to those who habituate themselves to it. Whilst delayed by the Rajah, we were regaled by the pure and refreshing juices from some green cocoanuts. At length his Highness arrived. He was a young man of very dark but handsomely formed features, darker by 2 shades than the Malays, about 5 feet 5 or 6 inches in height, of slender form, and attired in the usual sarong, a yellow silk sandalong or sash around the waist, in which a kris of handsome manufacture was placed, a close baju or jacket with plated buttons in front, upon his head a turban of white cloth without any decorations, and gold bangles around his wrists and ankles. His attendants were almost all Moormen, or natives of Bengal and Madras, many from the latter countries, and others of that extraction born at this place. The Rajah, although born here, had the appearance of being of Bengal parentage. The grave old gentlemen around were the principal spokesmen on affairs of business. It was the object of Mr. Fearon to purchase a cargo of areca nut for the China market, for which object he had brought dollars, opium, iron, lead, and steel. Most of the bearded gentlemen were traders in the areca nut, but a tall, thin, elderly, and shrewd old man was the principal agent in the transactions between Mr. Fearon and the Rajah, for the latter, like most Rajahs, had but little to say on the affair, and, from being young, had merely to approve of whatever was done. This agent, whom we designated Minister of the Board of Trade, proved to be uncle to the present Rajah. This circumstance accounted for his having so much to do with the government affairs. After some commonplace conversation, the commercial business was introduced, samples or musters of the quality of the nuts were shown, and an arrangement was entered into between the parties for the delivery of 3,000 pekels, in 10 days, at the rate of $1.50 the peckle, iron, steel, lead and dollars being given in exchange, at prices then agreed upon. The contract was ratified by the old trading minister, placing his right hand of the supercargo into that of the Rajah, repeating as they remained with joined hands the terms assented to. All agreements are made in the name of the Rajah, and are written and signed by both parties. They had abundance of opium, as much, they informed us, as 700 chests unsold. It had been purchased at $700 the chest, the cost price at Batavia at this time, but the areca nut had been delivered in exchange at the rate of $1 the peckle. After the commercial affairs had been settled, the Rajah, ministers and merchants accompanied us about, and in the vicinity of the village, followed by a nondescript rabble. My collecting plants and insects amused some and puzzled others, and all were desirous of ascertaining for what purpose I required them, whether we had any flowers in our country, whether they were to feed animals, and the insects for birds on board the ship. But when at last they were informed I was a curer of diseases, they remained perfectly satisfied that I collected them for medicinal purposes, and without making another inquiry on the subject, resumed their almost perpetual conversation on the areca or betel nut. On the way the Rajah gathered a plant, Chenopodium family, and giving it to me, said it was medicinal, and called it by the Malays Gunche Maju, signifying shirt buttons, and the name was probably applied to it from the elevated buds having some resemblance to them. The plant is used by the natives in the form of decoction as an internal remedy for various diseases, and as far as I could understand them, was possessed of emetic properties. It is a small plant and grows abundantly on the banks of the paddy fields and on most of the waste land about the village. Among a profusion of other flowering shrubs and plants was the Cassia occidentalis, bandrum of the natives, several species of Solanium, and pretty Vinca rosea, or rose periwinkle, Datura fastuosa, the fruit of which the natives told me would cause madness if eaten. It was named by them tropongo. Several species of convolvoli, a species of senecchio, with a number of others, wild and cultivated, some of which exhaled fragrant odours, and a multitude of butterflies and other insects, vying with one another in brilliancy and harmony of colours, flew about in apparent enjoyment of the fervent tropical sun, among the profusion of flowers which strewed the ground. The Jatropha curcas, or banawa, of the natives was planted, as well as the bamboo for fences. Rice fields were numerous, but this being the dry season, the fields were dry, and the harvest collected. The variety of succulent and other plants that sprung up about them afforded excellent feeding for the numerous herds of cattle rambling about. During the rainy season, which occurs from about November to nearly the termination of the month of February, the planting of rice takes place. The fields, for the most part dry at the present time, are then overflown. The season of the rice harvest usually occurs in April. The country, although flat, had a pleasing, fertile aspect, and when the vivid green or golden yellow of the rice plantation was added, its beauty must be still further increased. The Rajah, his followers, and the merchants appear to be all Moormen, neither natives of or descendants from those born in Hindostan. The bazaar trade appears for the most part also to be monopolized by them. The Malays seem the tillers of the soil, or subordinates in other respects. The Hindustani natives, or their descendants, are evidently the conquerors of the coast, and of course the heads of government are of that race. The Rajah made Mr. Fearon a present of the small bullock, cocoanuts, plantains, sugar canes, etc., and accepted an invitation to visit the ship the day following, when it would be requisite, from their professing the Mahometan creed, that all pigs should be kept from grunting, or getting an afternoon's liberty. About noon, taking leave of the Rajah and his party, we returned on board. At this place no canoes came off to the ship with fish, fowls, fruit, etc., for sale. None but those on business came to the ship, and Mr. Fearon was advised by the Rajah not to allow any to do so. This appeared strange, as for off other villages to the eastward of Pedir, goats, fruit, fowls, yams, etc., were brought off for sale. But we afterwards had good reason for suspecting that some of the Rajah's followers were desirous of supplying the ship, placing their own prices on the articles, allowing a percentage to His Highness, and thus contrived to have a prohibition placed on canoes coming alongside. End of section 19.